in the Old Testament book of Haggai. If you're visiting with us here today, there should be some Bibles around in the pews. And if you don't know where the book of Haggai is, if you know where the Gospel of Matthew is in the beginning of the New Testament, just turn back from there a couple of pages and you'll see the book of Malachi, and then Zechariah, and then finally the little two-chapter book of Haggai. And we will be reading from Haggai chapter 2 in just a moment here. Well, last week we, as I noted, bottomed out in our study of the minor prophets as we looked together at the very harsh and very sharp book of Zephaniah. And I mentioned in the introduction to that particular lesson that pretty soon we would be coming back on an upward swing. Because I realize, especially over the last 5 or 6 weeks as we have gone through this middle section of the minor prophets, these are some fairly hard-hitting sort of books. They take up very difficult subjects, and they talk about evil and wickedness and God's judgment and all of that kind of stuff. And so if a person is not careful, you can kind of get bogged down in that sort of material and come away depressed rather than hopeful, which you would hope to be as Christians in God. Well, I'm happy to tell you this morning we are going to begin now that upward climb as we come out of these prophetic books, because as we come into the final 3 books here in the prophetic section of the Old Testament, we are going to now move into a different time period in Israel's history. And this is very important to grasp as you come into these final books. So far in our study of the minor prophets, everything that we have looked at has been leading up to 2 terrible events in the history of the people of God. The first was the prophesied captivity of the northern 10 tribes of Israel. These were the prophets like Amos and Hosea and Micah who were foretelling the downfall of Israel, and they promised the Assyrians were going to come in and take them captive, and guess what? That has happened. Not only has that happened, but they have not only been taken into captivity, they have been utterly destroyed. You want to look for a historical line that comes down from the 10 tribes of Israel, you won't find it. They're decimated. The second part of this same aspect has been the prophetic books who foretold the destruction then of the southern kingdom of Judah. This doesn't happen for well over a century after the Israelites fall to Assyria, but a new power is now coming on the horizon in the form of Babylon. And so God has prophesied the same thing for Judah that he did for the people of Israel. If you do not repent, and if you do not turn from your wicked ways, God is going to enslave you. And so in books like Habakkuk and Joel and Zephaniah, we got a picture of what God intended to do if they did not turn from their share of wickedness. Well, as we come now into the final 3 prophetic books of the Old Testament, all of these events that we have been anticipating in our reading and study of these books have now come to pass. As I said a minute ago, Israel has been taken into captivity and destroyed. Judah has been taken into captivity, and while they are not destroyed, they have now lived 1 full generation in Babylon. But now, something is about to change. Something huge is about to change. Babylon has suddenly become weak in the knees. And so as this ruler rises up among the Medes and the Persians named Cyrus, he leads a campaign into Babylon and he conquers that ancient, powerful city. And when he does so, he has a very different policy than the Babylonians did. Rather than collecting up all the people that they had conquered, the Persians are going to send the people back into their land. They want them to rebuild their lives. And more importantly, Cyrus wants them to rebuild their temples. This is his way, you see, of ensuring himself the favor of all of the gods. So the Jews are included in this policy. And after 70-some years of living in captivity and slavery in Babylon, they are now allowed to go back to their homeland to rebuild the temple. And it is the events that immediately follow that particular decree that give rise for the need of the prophet Haggai and his particular message. We've already had one portion of that read to us here this morning, And today I would like to focus in specifically on chapter 2, which is the second of 4 messages in this book. So if you would, begin reading with me in Haggai chapter 2. We're going to read the first 9 verses together. On the 21st day of the 7th month, the word of the Lord came through the prophet Haggai. Speak to Zerubbabel, son of Shealtiel, governor of Judah, and Joshua, the son of Jehozadak, the high priest, and to the remnant of the people. Ask them, who of you was left who saw this house, he's talking about the temple, who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? Does it not seem like nothing? But now be strong, O Zerubbabel, declares the Lord. Be strong, O Joshua, son of Jehozadak, the high priest. Be strong, all you people of the land, declares the Lord, and work. For I am with you, declares the Lord Almighty. This is what I covenanted with you when you came out of Egypt, and my spirit remains among you, so do not fear. This is what the Lord Almighty says, in yet a little while I will once more shake the heavens and the earth, the sea and the dry land. I will shake all the nations, and the desired of all the nations will come, and I will fill this house with glory, says the Lord Almighty. The silver is mine, and the gold is mine, declares the Lord Almighty. The glory of this present house will be greater than the glory of the former house, says the Lord Almighty. And in this place I will grant peace, declares the Lord Almighty. Believe it or not, as small and obscure as the Old Testament book of Haggai is, this is not the first time that we have studied the book of Haggai together as a congregation. As a matter of fact, as I was doing some research for this particular lesson, I remembered that we had done some study on the book of Haggai before, so I went back through my archives, which expands about 7 years now, and I went to look for that sermon that I had preached at that particular time. And I, of course, don't expect any of you all to remember this because I barely remember it myself. But when I did this particular lesson on the book of Haggai, it was over 5 years ago. And here was the context for that particular sermon. At that time, we were making preparations to move into this building. And of course, before us were some major decisions. How are we going to renovate? How are we going to raise the finances? How are we going to do all the things that we need to do to bring this building up to date? This was obviously going to be a very expensive and a very time-consuming project, and so at the time I was looking for a text that would help us to dig deep and try to inspire us to come up with a challenge to do what needed to be done to rebuild the house of the Lord. Well, the text that I chose at that time was from the first chapter of the book of Haggai that Guy read for us just a little bit earlier this morning. I'm hoping it's kind of fresh in your mind. That's why I had him read it to us. But what that text is about is both a rebuke and a challenge to rebuild God's temple. The rebuke comes in a form of scolding the people of Israel because they had come back into the land and they weren't building the temple. They were building their own lives, and they were building their own houses and doing their own thing, while the temple at that point was merely in ruins. And so the challenge came from God in asking them to put aside their own interests, their own ambitions for the moment, and to give themselves fully to the work of rebuilding the temple. So, based on that text, at that time I put forward a challenge to you. To put aside for a moment your own financial interests, to put aside for a moment your own needs of time and that sort of thing, and to come together and rebuild the house of the Lord. And I am happy to say you all met that challenge, and today we are enjoying the benefit of that fact. What is hard for me to believe as I reflect back on all of that now is that was nearly 5 years ago. As a matter of fact, this March we will celebrate 5 years of being here together in this building. Can you believe that? Can you believe it's been 5 years? You know, I don't know how long it was that it took us to actually do the renovation work. What was it, Stephen? About 10 months? It seemed like an eternity. I'll just tell you that. I don't know about you, and I know Stephen felt the same way, but it just seemed like an eternity. But now, as long as that 10 months felt like, here we are, and 5 years passes in a flash. For me, it's been a great 5 years. But I'll tell you one of the neat things that I have had the chance to experience over the last same time period, over that 5-year period. On several occasions, probably a handful of occasions, I have had people come in the middle of the week who at one time or another had been in this congregation. Most of them had grew up here in this church and had gone on, of course, to bigger cities and bigger churches and that sort of thing. But they came back and they wanted to see the place where they grew up. So whether it was the 100-year centennial that brought them back, or one of our many 4th of July celebrations, or for a wedding, or for a funeral, or all that kind of stuff, they wanted to come back and see the church because they had heard of what we had done. So, of course, naturally, I would take them around and I'd show them all the renovations we had done. I showed the pictures of the church, what it first looked like when it was built, and then what it looked like when it had the brown paneling, and then what it looks like now. And, of course, they were impressed with all that kind of stuff. But what they really wanted to see was not so much the pictures. What they wanted to see was the place that they had had their memories. And so as we would come in here, they would tell me the stories. I was baptized right up there, they would say. I used to sit right down over here. I remember getting in trouble once right over there. I remember that we were married right here. All of these memories that meant so much to people as they remembered the glory days of the past. As happy as most of those memories are that people shared, you could tell that there was also just a little hint of sadness in their stories. Now, the sadness didn't come from their memories per se. Those, for the most part, were happy memories. But the sadness came from them in their own sense of their own life, that the glory days were gone. That the days that had meant so much to them would never quite ever be the same again. Well, 5 years later, as we return once again to the study of the book of Haggai, we are going to take the opportunity here this morning to observe a very similar sentiment that is being expressed by the people of God upon their return to Jerusalem. Now, this is great news. Finally, the people, after all these years, are going to go back to their land and back to their rightful place. And in some cases, especially for the elderly, they're getting to go back to where all their childhood memories were. But as they come back to Jerusalem, in what amounts to the ruins that were left in Babylon, their return was hardly the romantic thing that they imagined it might be all those years in captivity. And what chapter 2 shows us is they were utterly discouraged by this. There were several elements that played into their particular discouragement as they came back into Jerusalem. One such element had to do with the fact that those who returned to Jerusalem to build the city and the temple was actually a fairly small number compared to the whole. If we're to go to the historical books of Ezra and Nehemiah and get kind of a count of all of those who came back to Jerusalem, it was only about 50,000 people who came back. Now, that's a lot of people, but when you take that number compared to the vast amount of people who are in captivity, it's a fairly small number who are actually going back to Jerusalem. And so a person wants to ask at this point, what accounts for this? Why are so few going back? Well, to be perfectly frank with you, I think many people have actually taken Jeremiah's advice to heart, and they have done what he's asked them to do. Earlier, Stephen read for us from the book of Jeremiah, and you remember what the scripture says. As Jeremiah is writing to the people just freshly in captivity in Babylon, the people are wanting to know, we got to get out of here. We got to do something, kick up enough dust, whatever it takes, so that we can get to go back home. And Jeremiah comes in and very gently tells them, That's not going to happen. Build houses and settle down, he says. Plant gardens and eat what they produce. Marry your sons and your daughters. Give your wives away, or find wives for your son and give your daughters away to be married. Seek the peace and prosperity of the city you're in, because if peace comes to it, peace will come to you. What Jeremiah is doing with that piece of advice is countering the message of the false prophets. The false prophets are saying, just hold on to hope, just kick up enough dust, just do enough, and we'll get to go back home. And Jeremiah says, forget about it. You're not going back home. God's going to see to it. So apparently, quite a number of people have actually taken this advice. They had built houses. They had built gardens. They established businesses and built families in their new land of exile. Was it ideal? No, it was not ideal, but it was a life. It was a life they had built. But like so many others, they had reaped the benefit of living in the world's most powerful economic city. So when Cyrus comes along to them and says, hey, you now have the option of going back home, many of them simply said, we're not interested. We've built our life here. Our business is here. Our family and grandkids are here. We'll just stay here. Who are the ones who went back? Well, two kinds, more than likely. Those who had fierce religious devotion, and secondly, those who had nothing to lose. Those who had not fared so well in Babylonian captivity. So to say that most of them who went back were poor and impoverished, that's very likely an understatement. And when you add to that fact that the city of Jerusalem is in ruins and that they had enemies on all sides, foreign nations who were hostile to them, and they had no wall to protect them from their enemies, the people are frozen. The young are utterly put off by the enormity of the task that lies before them, and the elderly are frozen in their nostalgia of the great days of Solomon's temple when it was in the glory days of Israel. So here's what ends up happening. They go home. They do rebuild the foundation of the temple, and they place an altar there so that they can do their sacrifices in the way that they should. But because of their poverty, and because of all of the enemies who were around them that kept them preoccupied, they looked at what all had to be done and they were greatly discouraged. And the work on the temple stopped. We're not talking about a momentary stop here. God's not being impatient with them. He's not prodding them. 16 years go by. And there's no work on the temple. All you have is a foundation and one altar sitting in the open air, and that's it. You know, as I was reflecting on this week, I was trying to imagine, what would that worship experience have been like in that day? And the only thing that I could really relate it to, and this is going to be trite, you have to forgive that, but it's the only experience I had, so it was the only thing that I could compare it to. But it was some experiences that I had one year in the youth group. It was the year that I turned 16. Matter of fact, I turned 16 on this particular mission trip. We had went down to Mexico. And that year, we were helping a church literally build a church building there, wherever it was that we were at. And so all summer long, they had youth groups coming down who were bringing supplies and different aspects of the deal. And we went pretty early. We went in June. And so all that they really had established there at that point in time is there was a slab which determined the foundation. And then around the area that was going to be the sanctuary, there was about a half wall, about waist high, that went all the way around the sanctuary. And so as we were there working and doing all that stuff, naturally, when Sunday came around, we were going to worship with the people there. And I remember sitting on the cinder block pews made out of 2x4s, And we sat there and worshiped God, and to be real truthfully, it was a really special experience. I suppose it'll be something that sticks with me until the day that I die. But that's because I was only doing it once. Can you imagine worshiping that way for 16 years? I was happy to come back to my church where there was air conditioning and padded pews and donuts and coffee. No, 16 years. But that's what they did. Why? Because they were discouraged. What they had come home to was only a fraction of what they had left. And because the glory of the present moment was nothing to be compared with the glory of the past and Solomon's grand temple, the present task seemed so overwhelming, they simply gave up and devoted themselves to their own lives. What God has sent the prophet Haggai to try to do is to rouse the people out of their apathy. Who of you is left, he asked, who saw this house in its former glory? How does it look to you now? And the answer would be quite pathetic. Thank you very much. But notice God's response. But now be strong, all you people of the land, and work, for I am with you. Yes, Haggai acknowledges the glory of the present is nothing compared with the glory of the past. Yes, Haggai acknowledges they are faced with difficulties on every side. Yes, their present efforts will be nothing like the notoriety and the glory of Solomon's temple. They just don't have the wealth. But what Haggai is writing them to remember is despite the gloominess of their present circumstances, they must remember this one fact: God is with them. They serve the God who is creator of heaven and earth, who created the world with a word and sustains that world with a word. Yes, everything may be gloomy and depressive about their own temporary position. And yes, certainly the glory of the present will be nothing compared with the glory of the past. But nonetheless, Haggai is reminding them of the truth behind it all. God is with them. God is guiding them. And God knows what He's doing. And I don't know about you, but to me that speaks volumes into our own current time and place. It is true not only in this congregation, but in all congregations like ours, all around West Texas, eastern New Mexico, southwest Oklahoma, that the glory of the past seems a lot bigger and more robust than the glory of the present. Membership is down. Young people have gone to the bigger cities, bigger churches. Does that mean that God is done with the church or churches like us? And the answer, as you might anticipate, is by no means. Not if we hear what God is saying to the people of God in Haggai. The same God that was with them, guess what? He's with us. And while it may not feel as big as it used to, in some ways it may not feel as important as it used to, it doesn't matter. God has work for us to do. And whatever that work may be, it's the right work for our time and our place. You know, when I think about Haggai's message, it takes me back really to the seminar that we had just about a month ago when David Langford was here. I realize not everybody was here to get to be a part of that, so this is good for me to bring it up. But what David talked about in some of his material based on the strategically small church was he talked about the great blessing of being a church of this particular size and of this particular demographic. It is true that we cannot do everything that a large congregation can do. But there are also things that we can do rather naturally that large churches, by their nature, will not be able to do. And as I thought about that this week, what are some ways that we can think about this? I thought about two things that are a great blessing about being a part of this congregation. One of them was on display this morning earlier when we celebrated a 100-year birthday when Willie Mae, and it'll be on display here again when we meet for our potluck dinner. And that is the intergenerational life of our congregation together. You know, interestingly enough, and I think David brought this up, but one of the things that the larger churches are having to do is to try to create programs that will bring people together, the young and the old together, to bring intergenerational relationships. And that's just the nature of the size that they are. And because often lots of them have contemporary worship or traditional worship, it tends to separate the young into one worship and the older into another worship. But here, what other churches have to create programs to do, we do naturally. We share in one another's lives over a vast age range. And I'll tell you, that means a lot to me personally. And it means a lot to Olya and I as a couple who are raising a family here in this congregation. Because we get to be around people who can give us wisdom because they've been through our part of life and share that with us. And that's important to me, but I especially cherish the way that my boys are loved and appreciated here in this congregation. And it may be true that we don't have a large range of children's classes to offer them. And it may be true that our teachers get worn out because they never get a break because we don't have enough people to pass around the responsibilities. But I love the fact that our children get to grow these very personal bonds with people that are much older than them. And I am convinced that will be something that they remember and something that makes a big impact on them. And that is something that this church does very well, not because it's trying to with a program, but because it is just a part of our natural life together. Here's a second thing I thought of this week. Think about all the ways that our members, through various programs and also through various individual efforts, bless people in our community with service. That's not only true about our church and this congregation, it's true about all the congregations here in this town. I was thinking about this the other day. Imagine what would happen if you pulled all of the churches out of Slayton. Who would be there to do the service for the community? Now, the service we're able to do, it is true that we're not even able to touch hardly the hem of the garment of all the problems that need to be touched. But imagine what would happen if you took all of the churches away. Things like Meals on Wheels, Kids Cafe, Snack Sack, Mary and Martha, and so many others. Not to mention all the individual efforts that don't have a name or a label put on them and then often go unrecognized. Without this church and other congregations in this community, that service would be nearly non-existent. So while it may be true that things were bigger in the past, that things were more robust in the past, it is also true that God remains very much with us in the work that we are able to do. Maybe we can't do all that we used to be able to do in the past. Maybe we can't do all the things that big churches are able to do with the more resources that they have, and that's okay. Because all God asks us to do is to bloom where we are planted and to use the resources that He has made available to us. And we can have this assurance, if He wants something done, we never lack the resources. That was all God was asking Israel to do. He wasn't asking them to rebuild Solomon's temple. They weren't capable of it. He wanted them to build the temple as they could build it. And His promise was, if you will do it, I will be with you. So my hope is, as we come into these last three minor prophets, that your spirits begin to lift up a little bit. We've taken some whippings from the first 9 prophets who are very harsh in their messages, and you know what? We need to hear those from time to time. But hear the word of the Lord this morning. In yet a little while, God will shake the heavens and the earth once again. And though things may not seem all that bright at the moment, you can better bet at that time, all the nations will fill the house of the Lord with a glory that will be previously unknown. And you and I, who have labored in more difficult days, will be there to see the glory. But until that day comes, may we do the duty of our present moment and our present time and let God take care of the rest. Because truly, church, the battle belongs to the Lord. Amen? Let's stand and sing.